Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave. The words sliced through the buzz of excitement in the gymnasium like a blade. Laughter stopped. Conversations trailed off. Phones lowered. All eyes slowly turned toward a tall man dressed in full marine dress blues. His name was John Matthews, a 22-year veteran of the United States Marine Corps. He stood with the posture of a man who had spent his life in service, chest out, head high, a row of hard-earned medals on his left breast, and decades of discipline behind every breath he took. Just moments ago, he had quietly walked into the school auditorium in Houston, Texas, wearing the uniform he had proudly earned, and taken a seat midway through the crowd. Today wasn't about him. Today was about his son, Marcus Matthews, graduating high school, the first in their family to do so. He didn't want to cause a scene. He didn't even want anyone to notice him. But someone had. 2 security guards approached. No greeting. No questions. Just a demand. We're going to have to ask you to leave. John blinked, stunned. Excuse me, he said politely, his voice steady but confused. One of the guards shifted uncomfortably, then leaned closer. You're making people uncomfortable, he said in a lowered voice, as if embarrassed to say it out loud. Uncomfortable? This man, who had served his country in 5 deployments, who had risked his life in combat zones, who had spent birthdays, anniversaries, and Christmases away from his family, so others could enjoy freedom, was now being told that his presence at his own son's graduation was making people uncomfortable? For a split second, John wondered if he misheard. Maybe they had confused him for someone else? Maybe it was a mistake. So he asked as calmly as he could, "Is there a problem? Am I breaking any rules?" The second guard, clearly nervous now that people were watching, simply shook his head. "No, sir. Just some people have complained. You're drawing attention." John looked around. A few heads turned away. A few stared. Some looked embarrassed, others confused. He stood there in his pressed blue uniform, spotless shoes, a Marine's pride glowing like a beacon. The same uniform that had once earned him salutes in airports and handshakes from strangers. Now, somehow, labeled as a problem. His son was just moments away from walking across the stage. This was supposed to be a moment of pride, not humiliation. Gasps could be heard. Whispers spread like wildfire. But still, nobody stood up. Nobody said a word. Most were too stunned. Others didn't know what to do. Some simply watched, phone cameras raised, unsure whether to record or intervene. John's hand briefly touched the medals on his chest. He looked toward the stage. His son hadn't seen anything yet. Good. He took a deep breath. After everything he'd been through, war zones, sleepless nights, battlefield loss, he had never felt this kind of sting. Disrespected. Dismissed. And for what? Simply existing in the wrong place, wearing the wrong uniform? The guards moved in closer, still urging him to leave. And just when it seemed like John might give in, just when the shame and pressure felt like too much to bear, it happened. From the back rows of the gym, 6 men stood up. They hadn't said a word until now. No one even noticed them. But in a matter of seconds, the entire energy of the room changed. Each man was calm, focused, purposeful, and each one wore a subtle patch or pin that only a trained eye could spot. One of them spoke, his voice like gravel. "He's not going anywhere. He's with us." Heads turned. The guards froze. And just like that, the next chapter of this story began. John Matthews had served his country with everything he had, 22 long years in the U.S. Marine Corps. He wasn't just another veteran. He was the real deal. 5 overseas deployments. Countless nights under fire. Commendations for bravery. Scars, both visible and hidden, that he carried with quiet pride. He had seen the world at its worst, stood shoulder to shoulder with heroes, and endured things most civilians could never imagine. But on this particular day, he wasn't Staff Sergeant Matthews. He was just Dad. And nothing in the world mattered more than being there for his son, Marcus, who was graduating high school that afternoon. The first Matthews to ever walk that stage. Marcus didn't know he was coming. John had been on duty overseas and wasn't sure if he'd be able to get leave in time. But through a miracle of timing and a few favors from old friends, John caught a flight home just hours before the ceremony. He didn't even stop at home. He changed into his uniform at the airport and went straight to the school auditorium. As he arrived, He didn't try to draw attention. He walked in quietly, purposefully. The polished black shoes, the crisp blue jacket, the signature white cap in his hand. The rows of service ribbons on his chest caught the light as he moved through the crowd. A few people noticed him and smiled. One older veteran in the audience nodded respectfully. Another woman clapped softly as he passed. But there were also those who stared, not with admiration, but with something else. Discomfort, confusion, suspicion. Still, John ignored it. His heart was focused on one thing: seeing Marcus's face when he walked across that stage. He found an empty seat a few rows back, sat down quietly, and waited. The program hadn't started yet. Students were still lining up. Teachers and families were still finding their seats. Everything seemed fine until two uniformed security guards began walking straight toward him. He thought maybe they needed help or were going to ask him a question. But instead, they stopped right beside his seat. One leaned in and said firmly, "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to step outside." John looked up, surprised. "I'm sorry," the second guard added. "We've had a few concerns. We're going to need you to leave." John stood slowly, not wanting to cause a scene. "Is there a problem? I haven't done anything wrong." His voice was calm, firm, but respectful. The same tone he used with new recruits on their first day. The guards exchanged an awkward glance. One said flatly, "We've had complaints. Some guests say they feel threatened." Threatened? John looked down at his uniform, at the medals he'd earned under fire, at the Marine insignia he wore with pride. Then he looked around the room. A few people avoided his gaze. Others were whispering. He felt a strange mix of emotions rising: confusion, then disbelief, and then a quiet anger. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that hurts. He was being treated like a threat. On American soil, at his son's graduation, simply for wearing the very uniform that represented sacrifice and protection. He looked the guard in the eye. "I'm just here to watch my son graduate." The guard didn't respond. He simply gestured again toward the exit. John could have argued, could have raised his voice, but that wasn't his way. Instead, he drew a deep breath. Years of military discipline kept him steady. He glanced back toward the stage where the graduates were starting to line up. He didn't want Marcus to see this. Not like this. Then, just as John began to consider whether he should leave quietly, something unexpected happened. A presence. A movement. From the back of the room, 6 figures began to stand. As John Matthews slowly rose to his feet, holding back the rising tide of emotion, the air in the auditorium seemed to grow heavier. Every parent, student, and teacher could sense something wasn't right, but no one dared speak. His son, Marcus, was just minutes away from walking across that stage. All John wanted was to sit in the crowd and clap when his boy's name was called. But now, thanks to whispered complaints and quiet discomfort, he was being told to leave, as though he were a problem, a threat, an outsider in the very country he had sworn to protect. John's chest rose and fell slowly as he controlled his breathing, a habit honed over decades in combat zones. But behind his calm eyes was a storm: humiliation, frustration, and above all, heartbreak. The room was silent. You could hear a pin drop. And then they stood. 6 men. From the back row of the auditorium, they rose almost in unison. No dramatic movements. No shouting. Just 6 figures, broad-shouldered, quiet, and focused, making their way toward John and the security guards with deliberate steps. At first, no one recognized them. They were dressed in plain clothes, jeans, boots, button-downs, blending in with the rest of the crowd. But there was something different about them. Something dangerously calm. The way they moved. The way their eyes locked onto the situation. Like wolves entering a room full of sheep. One of the men, tall, square-jawed, with short-cropped hair and a quiet authority, stepped in between the guards and John. "He's not going anywhere," he said firmly, his voice low but commanding. "He's with us." The guards froze, caught completely off guard. One opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. The other instinctively stepped back. The auditorium's attention shifted. Dozens of eyes turned toward the confrontation. Even the principal on stage stopped mid-sentence. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the men reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge. He held it up high enough for everyone, including the guards, to see. U.S. Navy SEAL. Another stepped forward and did the same. SEAL Team 6. Now the guards looked truly rattled. What had started as a quiet removal of a problem guest had suddenly become a standoff with some of the most elite military operatives in the world. All 6 men were U.S. Navy SEALs, brothers in arms who had served with John on classified missions overseas. They had spilled blood together, saved each other's lives. They weren't just friends. They were family. The lead SEAL turned his gaze on the guards, eyes like steel, and said slowly, clearly, and without blinking, "You don't disrespect a Marine on our watch." The weight of that sentence dropped like an anchor in the room. No one moved. The guards lowered their heads, silently stepping back. No apology. No explanation. Just the quiet shame of knowing they'd crossed a line they never should have. One of the SEALs placed a hand on John's shoulder. Another offered him a chair. A third scanned the room, daring anyone else to say something. John didn't say much. He simply nodded in thanks. Not because he needed rescuing, but because these men had reminded the world what honor looks like. In the crowd, someone started clapping, then another. Then a wave of applause echoed through the auditorium, loud, thunderous, and full of meaning. And with that, John sat back down. His son's name was about to be called, and this time, nothing was going to stop him from witnessing it. The security guards, visibly rattled and out of their depth, took one last look at the 6 Navy SEALs standing firm beside John Matthews. Without another word, no apology, no justification, they simply turned and walked away, fading into the edge of the auditorium like ghosts retreating into the shadows. The tension in the room didn't immediately lift. It lingered, hanging thick in the air like the aftermath of a storm. But the SEALs didn't move. They stayed right where they were, forming a quiet line of defense around their fellow warrior. One of them offered John his seat. Another gently patted him on the back. It wasn't a grand display. There were no raised voices, no chest-pounding speeches, just silent solidarity, the kind that speaks louder than any microphone ever could. John sat down again, slower this time. You could see the toll the moment had taken. His hands were still, resting on his lap, but his eyes that had seen war and loss, glistened now with something deeper. Not pain, not anger, gratitude. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Then, something unexpected happened. It began with a single pair of hands clapping. Then another, and another. The sound built quickly, growing like a wave until it filled the entire auditorium. People stood up, not just the students, not just the teachers. Everyone. Parents who didn't know John. Grandparents, janitors, faculty members, even the principal himself. All standing, all clapping. Not just for John Matthews, but for every man and woman in uniform. Those who had served quietly, courageously, and often without recognition. The standing ovation wasn't just about what had just happened. It was about what happens far too often when those who serve are overlooked, disrespected, or made to feel out of place in the very country they defended. The applause went on. A full minute. Then 2. Some people cried. Others saluted. Even students who moments before had been scrolling on their phones were now on their feet. Some with their hands over their hearts. Others simply staring, their faces soft with realization. John wiped at the corner of his eye. He wasn't a man who sought attention. He hadn't come here looking for applause. All he wanted was to see his son walk across the stage. A simple wish held by every parent in that room. And then, finally, it happened. Marcus Matthews. The announcer's voice rang out across the auditorium, amplified and clear. Marcus walked proudly across the stage in his cap and gown, his head held high. He scanned the crowd instinctively, looking for familiar faces. Then he saw him, his dad, still in his Marine dress blues, still seated, but now surrounded by standing ovation, loyalty, and love. Marcus froze for just a moment, and then smiled wider than he ever had. He raised his diploma high as if saying, "This is for you, Dad." John smiled back, that proud Marine resolve softening into a father's deepest joy. In that moment, the auditorium wasn't just a school gym anymore. It was a symbol of respect reclaimed, of brotherhood, of a father's love, and of a country that still remembers what true service looks like. And for John Matthews, that moment made every mile traveled, every scar carried, and every uniform worn worth it. Because in the end, he got to see his son graduate, and nothing, not even misplaced fear or ignorance, could take that away. As the principal called out Marcus Matthews, the young graduate walked confidently toward the center of the stage, his cap slightly tilted and his robe swaying with each step. Cheers erupted from the crowd, but Marcus's eyes weren't on the stage, the camera, or even the diploma being handed to him. He was searching for one face, and when he saw it, seated among 6 towering Navy SEALs in full Marine dress blues, with tearful eyes and a chest full of medals, he froze mid-step. The auditorium fell silent again, unsure of what was happening. The principal, recognizing the emotional gravity of the moment, gently rested a hand on Marcus's shoulder and leaned in. "Go ahead, son." Marcus turned to the audience, raised his arm, and pointed. "That's my father, the U.S. Marine, and my hero." The words echoed across the auditorium, clear and proud. No microphone was needed. The truth carried its own volume. The crowd erupted once more, this time louder than ever before. Applause thundered. Some people stood again. Others were too emotional to move, wiping away tears as they captured the moment on their phones. And that's when everything changed. Within hours, the video, shaky, real, and raw, was uploaded to social media. The story spread like wildfire. Marine asked to leave son's graduation until Navy SEALs stepped in. It was more than just a viral moment. It was a mirror, a reflection of something deeper in society. The way so many veterans are treated when the uniform comes off. The questions began pouring in. Why was this man, a decorated Marine, asked to leave? Why was his presence considered threatening? Would this have happened if he wasn't wearing that uniform? Or if he didn't look the way he looked? People were angry, but more importantly, they were listening. The school district eventually issued a brief, vague statement. They blamed the situation on a miscommunication and said procedures were being reviewed. No names were mentioned, no clear responsibility taken, and no direct apology was given to John Matthews or his family. But something bigger began to take shape. Veterans organizations reached out to John, from local chapters to national groups. Some wanted to offer him awards. Others simply called to say, "Thank you, brother." News outlets picked up the story. It made national television, podcasts, online articles, and radio talk shows. Even lawmakers began referencing it in discussions about veteran treatment and public awareness. And most importantly, conversations started happening in barbershops, schools, break rooms, and kitchen tables across the country. People were talking about how veterans are too often unseen, misunderstood, or treated with quiet discomfort rather than open gratitude. Not every moment of disrespect is loud. Sometimes it's a glance, a gesture, a cold shoulder. And now, those moments were under the spotlight. John Matthews? He didn't ride the media wave. He didn't demand interviews or give fiery speeches. That wasn't his style. When reporters finally reached him, he offered just one calm, humble statement. "I didn't want attention. I just wanted to see my son graduate. But I'm thankful my brothers have my back, like they always have." And with that, he returned to what he loved most, being a father. As for Marcus, he carried that day with him. Not just as the moment he graduated high school, but the moment he saw the world finally recognize his father the way he always had. Not just as a Marine, not just as a veteran, but as a hero in every sense of the word.